Okay, so we're going to kind of put together all of that information about the A, C, and D stuff, like the moving around square root stuff that we did in class today. And we're going to apply them to some problems. So go ahead and log into Delta Math, find the topic 18 practice assignment, and then we're going to do examples 1 through 8 together, and the rest of it is going to be for you. So that should be a 16 at the bottom. So we'll do the first 8 together, go do the last 8 on your own. Okay. So we're going to be pulling out graph characteristics without looking at graphs. Now, if you're super visual and you need to look at a graph, you can. So I set up an easy graphing calculator for you. If you go back into the same Desmos activity we were using in class by going to student.desmos.com and logging in, if you go to slide 6, there's a graphing calculator set up there for you. So you can just type in the equation that you want to see and it will graph it for you. But I'm going to go through how to do all of this without a graph. So example number 1 is find the starting point or the vertex of this square root function. So the starting point is going to be your C and D values. So remember, your x lies to you, so the C is always opposite as it appears. So even though it looks like x minus 3, we're going to actually make it a positive 3 when we go down to our starting point. Remember, your C is always opposite. And then the D value, the number that's being added or subtracted to the very end of the equation outside of the square root, is going to be the y coordinate of your starting point. So we're going to make that a 5. So pretty easy. Our starting point is 3, 5. You can either follow along on your Delta Math right now and type your answers in, or you can just write these down and follow along and go back afterwards and fill those in while you're working on your OYOs. So then if I go to my second problem, it's just evaluating a square root function. So we want to find f of 12. So the 12 replaced the x here, which means I'm going to replace all of the x's in the equation with a 12. So I'm going to get f of 12 is the square root of 12 minus 3 plus 5. So 12 minus 3 is 9. So I'm going to take the square root of 9 plus 5. The square root of 9 is 3. And then 3 plus 5 is equal to 8. So f of 12 is equal to 8. So you just want to make sure you follow your order of operations really carefully, and you're going to simplify inside the square root first, take the square root, and then deal with the numbers on the outside. Now, I think the hardest part of this is the next 2 questions, and that's evaluating your domain and range, especially if you're not looking at a graph. So if we look at example 3 to find the domain, you need to know 2 things in order to find the domain. You need to know the starting point, and you need to know the A value. So I'm going to just sketch a quick graph, and we're not going to make a ton of points like we did when we graphed the square root function at the start of class. We're just going to generally graph it. So we found the starting point was at 3, 5, so maybe that's around here. And then the A value is the number that sits in front of the square root, and since I don't see a number, there's a 1 there. So my A value is positive 1, which means that it's going up. I have a positive A value, so it's going up. So it's going to have that same shape that it normally does when we graph it, like our normal square root function that we graphed at the start of our notes. So then we have to know for our domain is our x's. So we always go from left to right on the x's. Right, so our leftmost x coordinate is at the starting point, and that's at 3. And since there's a solid dot there, I'm going to use a bracket. And then my arrow goes out to the right forever. My function continues to go down to the right forever. So it's going out to positive infinity, which always gets a parenthesis. So on Delta Math, you're going to want to use these keys down below. So you're going to want to use this one that has the bracket and then the parenthesis, and then you can use the infinity key to help type that in. So I'm just going to take our graph, because we're going to just find the range, and we're finding the range of the same equation. I'm just going to copy it down to my next slide. So now the range, right, is your lowest y to your highest y. So by looking at our quick little sketch here, we can see that our lowest y-coordinate is the starting point. It's the lowest point. So we're going to start at 5, and it's going to get a bracket because it's a solid point, and the graph goes up forever, so we're going to infinity. So again, we're going to use that bracket parenthesis key, and then the infinity sign. So now if you kind of feel comfortable with this stuff, feel free to go ahead and try the next 4 problems on your own, but I'm going to go through them here too. So if you want to try them on your own, just pause the video and then you can unpause to check your answers. So the next 4 problems are just on a different function. So we have g of x equals -2 times the square root of x plus 4, and then all minus 1. So remember, our starting point comes from our c and our d. So since I'm adding 4 on the inside with x, my starting point is going to have an x-coordinate of -4. If it helps you to remember it like this, you can always set the inside equal to 0. Right? And then if you solve for x, you would get x equals -4. So that tells you the x-coordinate is -4. And then the number on the end is the y-coordinate. So our starting point is going to be at -4, -1. So hopefully we're starting to get the hang of grabbing out those starting points. And then let's also make sure we know how to evaluate this function at a different value when there's that extra number in the front. So we're finding g of 21. So I want to replace the x's with a 21. So I have -2 times the square root of 21 plus 4, and then outside of the square root, I'm subtracting 1. So you want to be careful that your square root symbol doesn't extend over the -1. So we always work from the inside out, right? Parentheses first. This is a grouping symbol, square roots. We do inside the square root first. So we get -2 times the square root of 25, all minus 1. And then the square root of 25 is 5. I can simplify that. -2 times 5 is -10. And -10 minus 1 is -11. So g of 21 is equal to -11. So you just want to make sure you go in the correct order when you're simplifying. Okay. So then we want to do our domain and range. So again, we need to know 2 things. So we need to know our starting point, and if I draw a quick XY sketch, right, my starting point here is going to be at -4, -1, so that's around there. And then my A value, right, is -2. Right, so it flips upside down. So since A is negative, I'm reflecting over the x-axis, it flips upside down, so my graph is going to look more like this. And then we just want to remember with our range, we're finding the domain. So for our domain, right, it's left to right. So I'm still starting at the leftmost point here at -4, which is going to get a bracket because it's a solid point. And then we're going out to the right forever, so that's going to get a parenthesis. So the domain is basically always going to be the starting point x-coordinate out to positive infinity. That very rarely changes. So your domain and ranges should always have the coordinate points from your starting point in there. So your starting point numbers should always show up in the domain and range. If not, you're doing it wrong. So the last question we're going to do together, and I'm just going to quick copy this graph so we can look at the range question. Okay, so now if we're looking at range, remember range goes from low to high. So our lowest y-coordinate, because this is going down, right, it's going to continue to go down forever. So the lowest point that this reaches on the y-axis is going to be -infinity. So we're going to actually start with -infinity, which means that we need to start with a parenthesis. And then our highest y-coordinate is going to be up here at -1. And that's going to get a bracket because that's a solid point. So we're going to have to use a different key here for our parenthesis and then a bracket. And then we're going to use the -infinity. So you just want to be careful that whenever your A value is negative, you're multiplying the front of your square root by a negative number. You're flipping your graph upside down. So you're going down to -infinity, and that's going to start your range since we always read it from low to high. So for the rest of